Good afternoon, everyone. Did anyone grab the thing that looked like a strawberry smoothie and then discover it was cold tomato soup? Yeah, that was not awesome. And then I grabbed like a spoon of something else, thinking it was something else, and it tasted nothing like I was expecting. It's like I just brushed my teeth or something. It was just really bad. Anyway, to contrast that for something very refreshing, we have an amazing Atlassian here, Tim Pedersen, who I just learned you've been with the company for over 12 years. That's absolutely nuts.
That's
So
right.
do you have a bobblehead?
I do have a bobblehead.
You
Yeah.
guys know what that is? When
So
you reach 10 years, you get your own bobblehead, and it's like in this little prized room in 341 in Sydney. Anyhow, if you've ever seen like the sketch integration that we announced at Summit, or the Gmail integration, or the Gmail integration, that comes from this team. And in fact, I would say that this team probably is the one that like pushes the envelope in terms of what are the cool things that we could do to integrate with other SaaS services, because they work with the partners that want to integrate with our stuff and vice versa, and they just make it happen. So I'm very happy to introduce Tim Pedersen. Thanks.
thanks for the warm welcome. Yeah, a little blushing. Um, so hi everyone. You may have seen me speak at summits or Atlas camps before, but I'm really excited about my talk today because usually when I'm presenting, I'm talking about the awesome stuff that Bitbucket has just done with their Connect framework, or exciting new features in Jira software. But today, I'm actually going to be talking about what my team has been working on for the last year. So, click. So the team that I joined a little bit over a year ago is called Strategic Integrations. I actually took over as the engineering lead from another Atlassian, well, a legendary Atlassian named Rich Manalang, who I'm sure all of you are very familiar with from his time in dev relations. So strategic integrations is basically charged with building first-party integrations between Atlassian tools and key third-party services. Now, we have an awesome triad working out of Sydney, including our product manager, sorry, there we go. Our awesome product manager, Caroline, who's sitting in the front row here, and our awesome designer, Natalie. So we form a triad. Atlassian, as I'm sure many of you know, works in triads with heads of product, engineering, and design, leading up the features and backlogs and things that we execute on. But we're backed up by a rockstar team of engineers from 3 cities across the Ukraine. And these guys do all of the hard work of bringing the visions that we design to life in the integrations that you use. So one of the really interesting things for me working in strategic integrations, this thing is rubbish, has been due to the fact that I used to be a core contributor to Atlassian-Connect, seeing the difference between the extension platforms that we've built out as part of the Atlassian API versus the API frameworks that some of the third parties that we integrate with have shipped. So over the last year, we've built integrations between Jira and Bitbucket and Confluence with some of our key cloud partners like Workplace by Facebook, Gmail, Sketch, Slack, and then various CRMs like Microsoft Dynamics, Salesforce, and HubSpot. So when we build an integration, actually let me step back. Back when I used to work on add-ons fairly regularly on Atlassian Connect in our products, I used to focus a lot on the Atlassian experience. So what it looks like, how you compose an app out of web panels and web items and webhooks and REST API invocations. But with integrations, you also have to think a little bit about what the user experience looks like off Atlassian in the third-party product that you're working with. So I'm going to be touching on, during this talk, a little bit about how we think about building a cohesive experience both on and off Atlassian with our integrations. So I went back and forth on content for this talk a few times because I realized not everyone here is building integrations. A lot of you are building apps which enhance the products that we ship to suit certain use cases that aren't met by our core offerings. So I'm kind of trying to balance the content in this talk between best practices for integrations and tips and tricks for getting the most out of the Atlassian Connect, REST, and webhook APIs that we've come up with over the year as we've had to ship these integrations. But I also want to share a little bit about our experience from a year more or less walking in the vendor's shoes. So we ship almost exclusively using exactly the same APIs as all of you do to build your apps. So we build on top of Connect, we build on top of Atlassian REST, and we consume Atlassian webhooks. And we keep our use of secret Atlassian backdoors to an absolute minimum. We do have one big unfair advantage, and that is that all of the system apps that we release, so things like Jira Cloud for Sketch and our workplace integration, are rolled out as system add-ons in Jira Cloud. So we do cut out the marketplace piece of the component in that we're pre-installed. But other than that, we have a pretty much vanilla platform similar to what you're building on. So this is our mission statement from the early days when we were first kind of pitching the team. The kind of high-level statement is that we're building integrations with key cloud partners. So it's not just Atlassian ramming the cloud down your throats every Atlas Camp and Summit. It's actually something that we take very seriously internally within ecosystem as well. So all of the integrations I'm going to show you today are with Jira, Bitbucket, and Confluence Cloud, as well as our cloud SaaS partners. And we're also building integrations that have a real impact on your workflows. So we're not just trying to build things in order to be able to showcase them at a partner conference. We want to build things that customers are actually going to use and that will enhance their productivity day to day. So when I say we need to build integrations that meaningfully and seamlessly integrate with your Atlassian products, there's kind of two big things that we want to get out of each integration. The first one is kind of obvious. We want to make improvements to your workflow. So there's an explosion of SaaS tools out there. And at Atlassian, we're not naive. We don't expect you to run your entire business just on the Atlassian stack. There's a wealth of tools out there that we need to be able to plug into in order to best support your workflows. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this. You'll see plenty of examples of this throughout the presentation, but the big idea is that you should be able to use all of the tools in your workflow without having 16 million browser tabs open. But there's another more nuanced thing that we try to get out of every integration that we build. And this is this idea of giving deeper context. So if you saw Scott's presentation at the Atlassian Summit on Tuesday, he was talking a lot about how we think of Jira as the unit of work, or the system of record for all of the work that you do inside your organization. Now, Jira might well be the unit of work, but behind every piece of work that you use, there's a wealth of hidden work artifacts strewn across all the tools that you use. There's sketch files, there's messages in Slack channels or posts on your workplace instance. There's builds in your continuous integration tool of choice or pull requests inside of Bitbucket. And you need good integrations to be able to surface and synthesize a unified context between all of these different things into one place. So this is something we're only just sort of starting to broach in some of our integrations, but eventually we'd like to be able to expose all of the hidden links between all of these different tools in one place when and where you need it. So let's step into looking at how we enhance your workflow with our tools. And first up, I'm going to be giving a few examples of what we learned building our integrations with Slack. So our team maintains integrations between Bitbucket, Jira, and Confluence, or the cloud variants of those products, and Slack. And one of the features of these integrations is the ability to send notifications to your Slack channels whenever an event occurs in one of the Atlassian products. Now, the way that we consume these events from each Atlassian product is via a webhook. Now, all of these three different integrations all share a common architecture because they're all basically doing the same thing, translating webhook events from our Atlassian products and rendering them as messages in Slack. And I'm just going to step through the life cycle of one of these messages to give you an overview of how this architecture works. So first up, we have an ingester microservice that sits inside Micros, which is the internal Atlassian PaaS. Now, as I mentioned before, our add-ons are all rolled out as system add-ons. So if we just naively had a webhook entry inside our Atlassian-Connect descriptor, like this, then we'd be receiving a web request every time anyone did anything in any Jira Cloud site. Similarly for Confluence and Bitbucket as well. So we're talking about a very, very, very large number of requests. Now, fortunately, Atlassian Connect supports a way of filtering webhooks. Now, how you use these filters isn't obvious at first because filters are defined statically inside your Atlassian Connect add-on, and that's shared across all of the tenants who install your add-on. However, the way you define a filter is as a JQL statement, and JQL also supports this concept of entity properties. I don't have enough time to go into all of the cool stuff that entity properties supports, But basically, it allows you to set little bits of data on different entities within our products. So every time a user creates a Slack subscription targeting a particular channel, we set this property, Slack subscriptions. We don't actually count the number of subscriptions. We just don't support booleans in our JQL. So we just literally are just doing this as a binary test. And then this means that we're only issued webhooks for projects that actually have subscriptions to Slack, which decimates the number of incoming requests we have and lets us scale a little bit more effectively. So once we've ingested the webhook, the first thing we do, and we keep our ingester service as lightweight as possible in order to scale. We truncate it if it's too long for a standard SQS message, and we put it onto a queue. For those of you unfamiliar with AWS, SQS is basically a simple message queue that you write to and read to from different services. And then we have the component in our architecture which does most of the work for our Slack integrations. And this is a scalable worker pool of, well, they're called hooks in workers, but basically they're charged with formatting or turning that webhook from the Atlassian product into a message that we can dispatch to Slack. Now, our webhooks can be a little bit anemic. That's partly for a performance point of view. So these these workers also call out to the Atlassian REST APIs to get the rest of the data that they need to format these messages. And this queue actually handles a couple of things. Well, the reason we have that queue there is for a couple of reasons. The first is that we can scale that worker pool to consume more messages based on load coming in from our webhooks. But it also means if there are issues invoking the Atlassian REST API when we get that additional data to render the messages, we can just pop that message back on the queue and then process it later once that issue's been resolved. So we get kind of two scaling and reliability aspects from that. So the next thing that these workers do after they've got all of that data is render it into a message that we can send to Slack. And when this surfaces kind of a key design challenge that we have across all of our integrations, and that is how do we render an Atlassian work item, so an issue or a pull request or a pipeline result, in a third-party context. And we've done it in kind of a variety of ways. So if you're using Jira Cloud for Slack, most of our representations of issues are tied to these notification events. So we show the actor who triggered the event, we show the old state and the new state, and then we show a little bit of summary data about the issue. So in this case, the issue summary and the issue's key. In Jira Cloud for Sketch, we know a little bit more about the persona who's likely using the integration. We suspect that they're probably going to be a designer. So we actually chose not to surface workflow status in this page, because in this view, because through our research, we discovered that designers often work in a way that's orthogonal to the typical Jira workflow. They're often pulled into issues via @mentions on comments, for example, rather than being assigned an issue and then transitioning the state through the formal workflow. So we show the issue type, the issue key, the summary, and the assignee of the issue in order to help them find that work quickly. Sometimes we're limited by the constraints of the third-party APIs that we're building on top of. So HubSpot has a seriously impressive range of things that you can do with it. There's like dozens of different extension points, just like we have in the Atlassian platform. But in the particular extension point we were targeting, which is a little record card on the CRM record view, we're only allowed to display 3 fields above the fold. So we chose to display the issue key, the summary, the status, and the assignee, based again on our user research into the types of clients who are using HubSpot. Workplace by Facebook, we had a little bit more flexibility, so we also pulled in the priority of the issue based on our analysis of users of which fields are important to users. And in the Gmail integration, we had a little bit more vertical space to play with, so we actually pull in different fields. And we're a little bit smart in this integration in that we promote different fields based on whether there's values set. In this case, I probably could have chosen a better example. But for example, if the security level was set, then that would be displayed above labels. But in this case, the label is set to anyway, I'll update these slides. Now, across all of these different integrations, deciding how you render a Jira issue in a third-party context is really difficult, because you can do a bit of research into the personas that are likely to use your integration. But in some cases, like Gmail, it's going to be really generic. It's going to has to apply to anyone who wants to interact with Jira via their Gmail client. And one of the, blessings/curses of Jira is that it's insanely customizable. So we've done a ton of research into the types of fields that Jira users like to see, and then we've kind of arbitrarily ranked them into different areas of importance when we have this kind of generic view. Now, the problem with this is that there are a lot of Jira users who are pretty passionate about the types of fields that they're using. I can see a lot of people taking photos of this slide, so please don't take this as gospel. Because I'm sure that there are other people, probably not taking photos, but who are outraged by the way that I've ranked these fields. And I've decided that, well, I've put security level above labels, which feels really arbitrary, and is going to probably offend a lot of your users. And this has come back and kind of helped us define our philosophy where it comes to how we approach integrations. Because Jira's customizability, as I said, is both a blessing and a curse. On Tuesday at the Summit keynote, Scott was talking a little bit about job boards that mention Atlassian skills as a job requirement. And he pointed out that there are literally tens of thousands of people out there building their careers on the fact that they have kick-ass Jira administration skills. And so there are people out there building all sorts of crazy workflows that support all kinds of crazy things, which is really cool from a user perspective, but super painful from a vendor perspective, building on top of the Atlassian platform. So for example, if you want to do something that sounds reasonably simple, like being able to create an issue from your integration, it quickly becomes very complex when you realize just how customizable Jira's workflow engine is. Because you can do things like require a certain field to be set on the issue creation screen. And if you don't set that field in your request to the REST API, then the creation process fails. So you might go, okay, let's support required fields. You start working on that. And then you read through the Jira REST API documentation and our workflow documentation, and you realize that to support required fields, you also need to support custom fields. And then there's dozens of different custom field types that you potentially need to support in your integration. And then 9 months down the track, you haven't shipped anything at all. So our philosophy is actually to ship simpler integrations that support a subset of those workflows, and then iterate based on user feedback later on. So Jira does have nice workflow APIs that do let you theoretically support all of these different things. But if you're building an integration that needs to service like all sorts of different Jira users with all sorts of different Jira setups, it's okay to actually just support a subset of them. And that's what we're doing internally on our team. In fact, on the Gmail screen, which I'll show you later, we surface a priority field on the edit screen for Jira issues. But we surface that even if priority isn't attached to your particular the workflow, which is attached to that screen, which is a little bit confusing for some users. But due to the nature of the Gmail app script process, for performance reasons, we kind of had to do that. So it's kind of like we're making a little bit of a decision that we think will help more users than it hurts. And then obviously we'll iterate on that based on feedback in the future. Now there is one caveat to this. You still need to have a good idea of the constraints of Jira workflows, because you need to test these workflows with your integration and make sure that it at least degrades gracefully. So, surface an error saying, oh, you have a required field on this workflow. I'm sorry, you can't execute this create issue operation. So now I want to give you a little performance tip. Can I just quick show of hands, because I'm curious about how much of this content is actually going to resonate. But does anyone know what the fields parameter does on a Jira REST API issue request? A few people? Cool. Okay, excellent. Well, at least I'm teaching a few of you. So, let me step back to this. So the Jira REST API actually lets you pare down the responses that you get back, and Bitbucket actually does as well, as we'll see shortly. So if I make a request to jira.atlassian.com, which is our central public-facing issue tracker for JRA9, which is an issue over a decade old at this point to implement user time zones, you get this huge JSON response, which has hundreds and hundreds of fields. And for an integration, we're probably surfacing like 3 or 4 of these fields. So if you append a fields parameter to it, then you can actually reduce the set of fields that are returned and reduce, well, both the work that Jira has to do to generate the response, and also dramatically reduce the number of bytes sent over the wire. So in this particular case, it takes a 270K response down to just over 1 kilobyte. And on my crappy Australian internet connection, which I tested once, it dropped it to 30% of the original response time, which is a pretty massive improvement when the user's sitting there waiting for their issue to load. Bitbucket also has a really cool API for doing exactly the same thing and follows, fortunately, a similar format. So for pull requests, issues, builds, repositories, all of the different data objects you can get back from Bitbucket, you can similarly constrain the payload size. The impact on performance isn't quite as dramatic, but it's still definitely worth the relatively simple investment needed to implement it. So stepping back to our Atlassian Slack architecture, the next step involves another queue. So we've got a double queue architecture for all of our Slack integrations. And the reason we have, basically once we've got a formatted Slack message, we put it on this queue, and then we have a relatively lightweight, scalable worker pool that picks those messages up and sends them to Slack. Now, the hooks-in workers kind of insulate us from excessive load in terms of webhooks and allow us to scale up into response to that load. And they also insulate us from REST API request errors made to the Atlassian API. And that second reason is why we have that second queue for Slack. So if there's an outage on the Slack side and the dispatch fails, then we just put the message back on the queue and wait for the Slack API to be available again. And this architecture has proved to be incredibly robust. Our Jira Cloud for Slack integration is enabled for 25%-ish of Jira Cloud and serves like 800,000 messages a day and is relatively cheap to run on AWS. So that's half of the story for our Atlassian Cloud for Slack integrations. But in our more recent integrations for Bitbucket and Confluence, we also allow you to take action on the notifications that are sent to Slack and drive our products via their REST APIs. So in a Bitbucket pull request notification, you have these little action buttons down the bottom that allow you to do things like merge the pull request with your choice of merge options. And then we update the message for the rest of the channel to see that a particular action has been taken. In Jira Cloud for Sketch, again focused on that design persona, we've built the ability to export design boards from Sketch directly to Jira from your Sketch desktop app. By just using drag and drop. And we also support the ability to leave comments and @mention users, which was a huge use case for our designers. And in Jira, we've attempted to build a slightly more full-blown issue editing experience that includes the ability to transition and reassign issues, based on the idea that when you're going through your thousands of emails from Atlassian products, you want a quick way to be able to triage and action those items. Another cool thing about this is it works on mobile too, at least on Android. Now, in order to build all of these features, we had to implement user authorization and allow our add-on to basically impersonate the user using the integration when it calls the REST APIs. Now, this is distinct from the approach of some add-ons that use the add-on bot user to make requests, or older integrations that maybe integrate with an application by nominating a particular administrative user on behalf of, who the actions are performed on the behalf of. So there are three really big reasons that we build user authorization into our products. The first is authorization. Basically, you want to make sure that the user who's performing the operation actually has the appropriate access to the resource that they're trying to action. The second is attribution. If you're leaving a comment or transitioning an issue, you want it to show up in the product as being attributed to that particular user. And the third reason we do user authorization is to be able to map users across the Atlassian product suite and across the third-party product suite. And this allows us to leverage some pretty cool features in the products that we're integrating with. So for example, in that Bitbucket pull request notification we were looking at before, we've got a button called Nudge Reviewers, which I'll talk about in a second because I'm getting out of order. But as you can see up here, actually you can't really see because it's a bit faded out. You see two of the usernames in the reviewers field have little @ symbols in front of it. Now what's happening there is that those are actual Bitbucket users who've been assigned to the pull request. But when we send the message to Slack, we actually translate those usernames from Bitbucket Atlassian users to Slack users, and that triggers a notification in Slack so that they get notified on their mobile device. But you'll notice that Caroline and Daniel don't have little @ symbols in front of them. And the reason for that is that Caroline's already approved this particular pull request, and Daniel is the actor who actually performed this particular action. So we don't want to notify either of those people because they've already completed their work on this particular work item. So we call these @mentions, just like the rest of the Atlassian cloud, and we call these ones sh-mentions or sh-mentions. So A mention still acts a little bit like an @mention in that if you click it, it will take you in the Slack console. It will take you to a direct message session with Slack. But we actually handcraft a link that mimics that behavior rather than rendering an actual @mention token. We actually didn't do this at first, and then built this mention system based on some very choicely worded feedback from some beta testers who were getting thousands of @mentions per day based on all of this activity that they didn't really care about. Now, user mapping also lets us build another cool feature, in fact, the most popular action in out of all of our Slack integrations that we've shipped to date, called nudge reviewers. Now, what nudge reviewers does is it iterates through all of the outstanding reviewers on this particular pull request, and then sends them a direct mention on behalf of the Bitbucket Cloud app, saying that someone wants you to review a particular pull request. Now, this solves that problem of having to manually @mention people yourself, passively aggressively asking them to complete your review so you can ship your code. It's not a particularly inspiring slide. So that's why user authorization is pretty cool. Now I want to talk about the 5 different ways you can achieve user authorization in the Atlassian cloud. The first is cookie-based auth, which is like literally hijacking your user's sessions and making requests to the REST API. This is not a good idea. The second is basic auth. Basic auth is asking the user to give you their password and then making requests to the API. This is also not a good idea. The third is API tokens, which is a nice replacement for basic authentication, which I'll be talking a bit more about in a second. The fourth is Jira's shiny new OAuth 2.3.0 API, which we've been proudly spruiking throughout Atlas Camp. And the fifth is the JWT OAuth 2 bearer token authorization grant flow, which actually bears very little relationship to OAuth 2, but does have some pretty cool use cases if you're building Atlassian-Connect add-ons. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about, in fact, I'm not going to talk about cookie or basic auth because it's deprecated as what's deprecated currently. And it's actually being removed forcefully from the Atlassian Cloud APIs on December 1st. That's okay. If you are using basic auth or cookie auth, there is a very simple replacement option. If you go to id.atlassian.com, or rather direct your users to go to id.atlassian.com, they can generate an API token which you can use in place of the user's password and basically drop it into your existing basic authorization flow. So an API token is basically a substitute for the user's password. Bitbucket, well, as you can see, you just drop it in as you would use the user's password. So Bitbucket has a similar concept called app passwords. It's even actually slightly superior to API tokens because you can actually scope the permissions granted to a particular password. So this is nice from a trust point of view as well. So API tokens are great and superior to basic auth, not only from a trust perspective, but also because it works with multi-factor authentication, which many users are using at the moment. It's also revocable by the end user without them having to go and change their password. The only downside about API tokens in id.atlassian.com is that they're unscoped, where they are in BB. The big downside, I guess, to using this, though, is that the user still has to go and manually do some stuff in their admin console in order to be able to complete your user flow. That's not so anymore with OAuth 2. So the Atlassian Gmail demo that Lucy did an awesome job of yesterday morning in the keynote takes advantage of Jira's new 3.0 flow. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because it is really well documented at bit.ly/Jira 3.0. But I did just want to go through the advantages of using it. It, again, works with multi-factor authentication. It's fully revocable by the end user. It's properly scoped, so you can opt into just the APIs that you need. And the biggest thing from an implementer's perspective is that it's standard. So you can just drop in whatever your favorite OAuth 2 client library is into your application and make requests. So you can use things like passport.js, which is what we use in all of our applications. So I did just want to quickly talk about the OAuth 2 JWT bearer token authorization grant flow, which we don't have a shorter name for because I'm not really sure how many people are actually using it. How many people are using OAuth JWT in their applications to impersonate users? Anyone? Okay, so yeah, 4 or 5 people. So the reason it's called OAuth 2 is because it uses bearer tokens, I think. But there's a big difference between the approach to JWT OAuth 2 and our new OAuth 2.3.0. And the big difference is that in OAuth 2.3.0, basically your application is requesting from each user permission to impersonate them. So, and then each user can individually opt in or opt out of that app, making requests to Jira on their behalf. Now, JWT OAuth 2 is a little bit different, and it's not really three-legged, because when instead of asking each end user individually, when an administrator goes to install your app, they get prompted as to whether the app can impersonate users in the site that add-on is being installed into. So it's sort of a delegated model where users are giving up the right the right to assent to authorization to the administrator instead. Now this is pretty powerful. It does mean that you don't have to prompt each user individually, and it means that you don't have to handle a range of cases like users revoking access, because basically the app is either installed or not, so you have the right to impersonate users or not. But this delegated consent flow is something that might stop some administrators from installing your app in the first place because of that trust consideration. So there is a little bit of a trade-off between the two of them. The other thing about this flow is that you have to have a Connect app for it. So if you're building an integration that is just purely a REST API client, then it's then you have to build an Atlassian-connect add-on just for the sake of being able to support this particular authorization flow, which is a bit painful. It's actually super easy to use, so the mechanics of it are all really well documented at the link on the screen. But I'm going to move on and talk about another problem that this user authorization has let us solve in some of the integrations that we're building. So one of the other integrations I mentioned before is Workplace by Facebook. Are there any Workplace users here? Okay. Workplace by Facebook is very similar to consumerfacebook.com, but except it's very tied to this idea of groups. So you create groups for things like project groups, for projects that you're working on, or different areas of your organization, and then you share updates with those groups by creating posts. And they've got this really cool API for plugging into post creation. So when you go to compose a new post, you can click the Jira Cloud button and then pick an issue. Now this leads us to having to solve an interesting problem, and that is, how do we figure out which issue the user is looking for when they press the Jira Cloud button? Now, getting this right is kind of important, because a recent report from McKinsey Global showed that knowledge workers spend almost 20% of their time, so like 1 day a week, just trying to track down stuff that they already know exists. So that's like going and executing JQL filters, messing around with Confluent Search, and scrolling through their email, trying to find that piece of work which they maybe remember like a keyword for. So we've played with a few different approaches to picking content, and the one that we've settled on is user-centric content. So making a request to the Jira REST API on behalf of the user and surfacing issues that relate to them, as opposed to like a hierarchical approach, like presenting a list of projects and then clicking in and trying to filter that way. So in Jira Cloud for Sketch, we support a few different filters in the issue list view. The first is issues the users recently viewed. The second is issues that are unresolved and assigned to them. And the third is issues that are mentioning them. And that speaks to the fact, is arguably useful for any user, but particularly useful for designers because they're quite often pulled in to work via @mentions. Now, does anyone in the audience consider themselves a bit of a JQL ninja? Anyone? A couple of people? Oh, I see you, Igor. So we're gonna have a little competition. So each of those filters is implemented as a JQL statement. Can anyone guess what the first little green underscored value there is? Who are we testing? Who's the assignee in this case? Yes. Current user, very nice. So you could hard code in the user's username, but JQL does have a handy function called current user, which will substitute based on the currently authenticated principal, i.e. the person making the request or who you're impersonating. Now, can anyone guess what property of the Jira issue we order by? Updated? Any other guesses? It's actually a pseudo property called last viewed. So updated is there is a compelling reason for searching via updated, because you could assume that recently updated issues are going to be more appropriate. But we actually took a different tack and decided that the order in which the user themselves interacted with the issue is going to most likely result in better search results. So you can imagine if I'm in a Jira issue tab and then I click through to Facebook to share information about that Jira issue, then I want the Jira issue I was just looking at to be at the top of the list. Speaking of recently viewed, can anyone guess how we implement the recently viewed filter? So we actually test that we rank issues. Sorry, we test that the issues that are returned by our recently viewed filter are a member of a particular set. Can anyone guess what that set is? Yes, very nice, it is. Issue history. Now, this may look a little bit redundant, and in fact, it is. Order by last viewed is actually perfectly valid JQL and will run. However, if you put issue in issue history in front of that, it returns roughly 20% faster for the Jira site that I tested on, which is ecosystem.atlassian.net, which is a very large Jira site, but still a significant performance gain. Now, the reason we put that there is that issue history is a much smaller set than every single Jira issue in your site, which is what you're getting if you query for order by last viewed. So if you're presenting, so issue history, I don't think we actually define the number of results, but it seems to be a static 15 when I've tested it. So if you're presenting less than 15 results to the user, which you hopefully are, because if they need to scroll past 15, it's probably not a great experience, then I recommend prepending your query with that. Now the last one is issues mentioning me. Now we're using a fuzzy text operator. I'm going to give you that, which is basically we're matching one field fuzzily against a particular function. Can anyone guess what that first field is? Text, very nice. So this is another pseudo property called text. And all of this stuff works in JQL as well, like not just clients from apps, but if you're building your own filters and things, you can use this too. Text matches against any text field associated with the issue. So it matches against the description, environment, comments, anything else. Can anyone guess what the right-hand side of that function is? It's a current user, very nice. Yes, it's current user again. So current user isn't just like naively substituting in the user's name. It also matches against @mentions. So if you put text tilde current user into the JQL search bar, it will return all of the issues that @mention you. And then you can, again, we order by last viewed based on that principle that users want to find stuff that they were recently looking at. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you about how we pick content. And look closely at what's happening in the Jira sketch video that I showed you before. So here we can see CCI 92 is at the top of the list of issues we've recently viewed. Now, if I click through to issues mentioning me and select another issue, say CCI 86, it's a little bit anemic there because we haven't exported any attachments from Slack yet, from Sketch. And then go back to recently viewed, you'll see that CCI 86 is now at the top of the list. Now, this could be a local cache of Jira issues that we're remembering that the user has interacted with from the integration, but it's actually not. What we're doing is when we make a call to the Jira REST API to retrieve the issue, we're appending a special property called update history. And this basically touches the issue from the user's perspective and updates that last viewed property that we were seeing. Now, this is a bit gross from like a REST 8OS perspective because we're like, as a side effect of a get, we're updating issue state. But if this scares you, you haven't spent enough time with the Jira REST API because there's definitely some other questionable decisions there. But this kind of speaks to that deeper context that I was talking about before. Because then if I navigate into the Jira UI and start searching for issues, that issue is again at that top of that list. And that filters out to all of the other integrations and tools that I'm using because they all use this same approach to picking content and showing recently viewed history. So that's what I'm trying to get at when I was talking about that deeper context idea before. Another way that we provide deeper context across tools is through this concept that Slack, I believe, coined the term of unfurling. Now, unfurling is the process of taking an URL or a URL and retrieving that content via REST and providing a preview of it in an integration, such as Slack. Now, URLs are great because they uniquely identify a resource sitting on a third-party product. And they're pretty easy to build. All you have to do is take that URL and translate that into the corresponding REST resource. And we actually use this to great effect in the Gmail integration that Lucy demoed yesterday morning. So the Gmail add-ons, when they're installed, you can ask for a particular scope that gives you access to the email that the user currently has open in their viewport. So what we do is we crawl through the currently open email looking for links to Atlassian work items. And we retrieve them and then display them in context. So here, and this is kind of useful like for notifications from Jira. So for example, here we have an issue update showing that the status has gone from blocked externally to done. But it doesn't give us the full context for what else is going on with that issue. But by fetching the content, we can display everything about that issue. including who it's assigned to, and comments and all of that good stuff. But the cool thing about being based on hyperlinks is that it works for other types of emails too. So there's no special markup in a Jira notification that triggers the add-on. If I send an email to my team which contains links that I've manually copied and pasted, then it will fetch those as well, and again provide that deep context. And this is really cool if you're using multiple Atlassian tools or multiple products from third parties that also maybe contain links to issues. So if you comment on like a Google Doc and paste in a link, then that will be surfaced on the notification that Google sends you. And it's really cool. So here's a kind of a neat example where Eric left a comment on a Jira issue saying that it maybe relates to another Jira issue and that there's a pull request that's open to address it. Now, this is pretty cool in that there's like 3 different links, but it's really valuable for my own workflow because when I see this message, I'm like, oh, I guess I got to go deal with this. But I pop open the Atlassian add-on and see that the 2 issues are done and the pull request is merged, and I can move on to the next email out of the hundreds that I have from Jira. So unfurling based on links is a pretty powerful technique in integrations. But Jira has a pretty special property that means we can unfurl based on issue keys as well. So this is a pretty genius decision from the early days from Mike and Scott building out Jira, where they decided to, instead of just have a monotonically incrementing identifier, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they decided to prefix issues with their project key. Now this is great because it means that we can go and retrieve content from your Jira cloud site based on the issue key. Now, obviously, issue keys are not globally unique, but they tend to be unique-ish within the context of a particular user, and we're only authorizing as a particular user. So 95% of Jira Cloud users use one Jira Cloud site. But even beyond that, project keys tend to be unique even if you're using multiple Jira Cloud sites, by virtue of the fact that if you have duplicate project keys within your frame of reference, then that's really confusing. So users naturally try to avoid that in the way that they administer their projects. So unfurling is one part of this, or providing content previews is one part of this flow. Excuse me. But every time we render one of these previews, our bot actually stores the fact that it was rendered in response to a particular Slack message. And we do this so we can close the loop on the Jira side as well. If you're using Jira Cloud for Slack, as soon as an issue is mentioned and unfurled in a particular channel, then a little entry appears in the Slack panel on the issue view showing that content. Actually, let me zoom in a bit for you there. So this is awesome because it provides you this deep context about all the areas where this particular work item is being discussed, and potentially surfaces some additional stuff about this piece of work you're about to pick up that you might not have otherwise discovered until later down the track. Now this is actually a pretty ancient concept in terms of the internet. A lot of early blogging platforms had this concept of trackbacks, where incoming requests to their blogging platform would have a referrer header, which would basically tell the platform where on the internet the user was coming from. And then they'd store that and render that as a little trackback area at the bottom of the page, so you can have a little vanity metric around all the places where people is talking about your content. Now we did add one more kind of interesting thing to the Slack integration, and that is that the Slack panel only appears once it's actually been mentioned in the context of a Slack channel. And the reason for this is that we wanted to hide the, basically prevent kind of additional cruft on the issue view. And the way that we do this is via conditions. I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit. But for those of you who are not familiar with Atlassian-Connect, to inject those little iframe components inside the issue view, you have to register something called a web panel. It contains a location, a URL, which is basically what the target of the iframe is going to be. And then you can also add some conditions, which basically turn the panel on and off. Now, conditions are statically defined in your descriptor, so apply to all of your different tenants. But again, we can leverage that cool entity properties concept to dynamically turn them on and off based on some use cases. So the first property that we use isn't super relevant. You probably don't need to implement this in your own apps, but it's just a facet of the fact that we are deployed across Jira Cloud, so we need to allow administrators to turn it off entirely if they don't want to use the integration, because they can't uninstall it. This second one is pretty important, though. So we also allow project administrators to disable it at the project level. And this is something that I don't see a lot of marketplace apps doing at the moment, and is actually super frustrating for a lot of users. And this again comes down to the Jira being so freaking customizable. Now, I often think of like technical teams using the add-ons that I built, or that we built. But quite often there's HR teams or marketing teams or service teams or IT teams using those projects as well. And if you're building an integration with a developer tool, say something that surfaces builds or pull requests, then those teams probably, like, if you're using your Jira project for an HR candidate pipeline, then that's just noise in that Jira issue view. So I would highly consider asking yourself the question of whether every Jira user really needs this piece of content, and then dynamically turning it on and off based on a project setting. And then finally, we also, as I mentioned before, only surface it once the issue's actually been mentioned. So we have a final entity property tied to the particular issue. And then we turn it off and on and off there as well. So thank you very much. I know it's been a ton of content. I hope it was useful for you. And if you have any more questions about integrations or Atlassian Connect or any of the other topics we've presented on, then come have a chat to Caroline or myself or Nat for the rest of AtlasCamp. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. And don't forget to please rate the talk in the app.